Hello and welcome back to the channel Airbus and What's It Doing Now. Welcome to the first in the series of Safety Corner. As I said in the heads up video, I'm not too sure what to call this. It was going to be flight safety, what, why and how, and it seemed a little bit long, so I needed something a little bit more catchy. So Safety Corner it is, and this is the very first in the series, and we're going to look at unreliable airspeed. So welcome to everybody, welcome to the existing members, and a very warm welcome also to the new subscribers. The subscriber count's gone up quite significantly actually over the last few days, so thank you for those who have shared the channel. It's really super useful in getting the word around and getting the channel out to everybody across the network and of Airbus operators, so it's hugely appreciated. We'll take a look at this safety first. Now, this is all material from the Safety First magazine, which anybody has access to. You can download these, and they're also available in a PDF format from the site. So this is Unreliable Airspeed on Takeoff. I'll put the link in the description below so you can read it and follow it through if you want, or read it at your leisure. But as I mentioned in the heads up, the aim is to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and how we can mitigate or trap the threat and mitigate it from happening. When we understand that these things do happen or can happen, and understand that it can happen to any one of us, it just teaches us to be a little bit more vigilant. Learning from other people's experience is probably just as good, if not better, than learning from our own. And the more exposure and the more knowledge we have of these events, I think it makes us better crew overall. And I think we have to be particularly vigilant now, more so than ever, as we've spent so much time away from flying, so much time away from the aircraft. We're going to feel very much out of our comfort zone, and all the things that we used to do regularly just need thinking about now, more so, I think, more so than ever. So yeah, I think also now, because aircraft have been parked and sat around for a long time, these unreliable airspeed events, we'll talk about the numbers and the detail a little bit later on, but they're very relevant, let's put it that way. So I'll put a link to some of the videos that are related to this topic actually, and I'll put them out in the description for you. But the 3 or 4 articles which have been released recently by Airbus through these Safety First articles. The first one is Pitot Pro Performance covered on the ground. The second one is Aircraft Parking and Storage. That was released in April 20. Preparing for a safe return to the skies. Many of you may have read this. This was in June 20. This was as we were coming out, if you like, the first lockdown last year. Look where we are now. And the other one I'm going to give you a link to, but I'll probably put it in the link above here somewhere, because I've actually included it in my channel. It's What About the Exterior Walkaround, and that really does look at just how important it is to be checking these things, particularly when we're talking about unreliable airspeed. Good, so I'll put those in the video description in the bottom, so if you care just to have a look down beneath there, you'll see the content, and you'll see a link in those descriptions. I'll try and put a hyperlink in there as well if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, so let's have a look at unreliable airspeed then. Unreliable airspeed on Takeoff. From the beginning of 2020 to March 21, there were 55 unreliable airspeed events on Takeoff reported to Airbus that involved in some way or another a blocked Pitot. These were primarily, the large portion of these were due to insects, dirt, or sand, or some sort of foreign object lodged inside the Pitot itself. One event actually recorded was a non-removal of the Pitot covers. So yeah, that's going to have obviously a significant effect, and arguably an easier one to spot. But having aircraft around for a long period of time, you might not spot that the fact there's a Pitot. Whichever aircraft you operate, you might be able to peer into it, but on large transport aircraft, you're not going to be able to get up that high. So this is why we need to be particularly vigilant when it comes to doing our cross-checking as the aircraft commences the takeoff roll. We'll talk about that more in a little while. But yes, one of those 55 events of unreliable airspeed recorded to Airbus actually involved one where the Pitot covers were not removed, and several opportunities to pick this up were missed. So this is where the critical lessons, I think, are learned. Okay, so yeah, let's take a look. I won't talk about that in too much detail at the moment because I'll come on to it in a moment. But the real take away from this is, like I said earlier on, a heightened awareness or a heightened vigilance for our walk around and just what we're doing during the takeoff roll. You only have to refer to your operations manual, your operations B, and refer back to the pilot flying and pilot monitoring's duties during the takeoff roll, and it's clearly written there, scanning the speed throughout the takeoff and a cross check there at 100 knots. If you like, this is where we can detect these potential speed discrepancies if or when you may get an ADR fault indicated. But the 100 knot call is pretty much one of the last chances we've got, particularly on the low speed side, to reject the takeoff and prevent us from getting airborne. So extra vigilance there is vital there, I think. But we'll talk more about that as we follow on. So the three following case studies we talk about highlight the importance of effective monitoring. I can't highlight that enough. The two of them were A330 events, and one of them was an A320. Now, I'm not technically proficient at all on the A330, but the broad principle is the same, and the same lessons are learned, and the same takeaways. So the broad principle is exactly the same. We could be talking about a 747 here. It wouldn't make any difference. The takeaways are exactly the same. So looking at case study one, then. Now, this was the one with the Pitot covers that were still attached to the aircraft. Now, again, this is a 330. I'll look at what happened, and then we'll have a look at why it happened and how we can mitigate and trap the threat. So 330 on takeoff, the speed flag appeared on both PFDs. So that's the first giveaway, really. Interestingly, the 100 knot and the VR rotate calls were called out based on ground speed. The after rotation, the speed on both PFDs indicated around 45 knots, and on rotation or after rotation, the unreliable airspeed procedure was carried out once airborne. 3 ADRs were turned off. The backup speed scale was then displayed. Then the crew then carried out their unreliable airspeed QRH procedure and then returned to carry out an overweight landing. So that's what happened. Let's just have a quick and a closer look at the PFD indications during the takeoff and just add some context to it. And I'll bring the slide up here if I haven't already. So what was going on here into the speed indications, and why did they get what they got? Now on the 330, between 0 and 50 knots ground speed, as the airspeed measured by the ADRs, because of course they were blocked, was less than 30, then the IAS on both PFDs will remain at the bottom. So that's when the ground speed indicator is less than 50, okay? So if the IASs don't read anything, then they'll just stay at the bottom. When the ground speed is between 50 and 140 knots, the speed flag was indicated on both. That's because the speed indicated was less than 30 and the ground speed was greater than 50. So just so that I'm not confusing you here, between 50 and 140 ground speed, they got the speed flags on the PFDs, and the reason they got that was the indicated speed was less than 30 and the ground speed was greater than 50. So the argument here is, once their ground speed was greater than 50, they got the speed flags. Again, that was another opportunity potentially to reject this takeoff. This was the critical part, I think, that was missed, and an opportunity then to carry out what would have ultimately been a low speed RTO. More of that in a moment. So 140 knots ground speed and greater to lift off. The IS indications on the PFD 1 and 2 registered about, I think, greater than 30 knots. I think it was about 40 knots, but the ISIS was still showing 0. And again, as the IAS was greater than 30 knots, then it started to indicate again. And I believe then, in my summation, that's really when the only point, I don't know, maybe that was the point that they realised that they had an indication problem, because both airspeeds were reading so low, and that's when they carried out the unreliable airspeed procedure. They got to about flight level 100 or 110, backup speed scale was on, and then of course they carried out the approach and overweight landing. So that's the what has happened. That's the why it's happened in terms of their indications. So I guess the next thing we need to look at is, how do we mitigate it? How do we trap this type of error from happening? And I think we can safely say here that there are a number of opportunities where this could have been prevented, or the aircraft could have been prevented from getting airborne. And I think that's the critical point. Again, I'm not trying to criticise anybody here, because actually, as the aircraft rotated, they carried out, when they've realised that they had the unreliable airspeed event, they carried out the procedure and came back and landed safely. But what we're trying to learn here is, how could we better manage this if it was to happen to ourselves, and how can we increase our safety margin? I think that's really what we get into to the bottom of here, and root cause. Ideally, if we had this event, we wanted to trap it the first instance, and then the rest of it we wouldn't have even largely. I'd have nothing to talk about, would I? So how do we mitigate it? So the first of a number of opportunities to mitigate this was, at the first instance, a thorough walk around. We could also argue that the engineers weren't terribly vigilant when they dispatched the airplane out of whatever storage it was at, or wherever it was at the time, that they didn't complete their checks. I'm presuming there must be some sort of checklist when the aircraft is released to surface, that these covers are removed before the aircraft is handed over. So clearly that wasn't done. And before the crew got to the aircraft, when the luggage or cargo, whatever was loaded, or as the aircraft was being pushed back, again, the exterior walkaround was required from the ground dispatcher, and that clearly wasn't done effectively. And lastly, for the flight crew, I think it was the captain in this case, because it was the first officer's sector, hadn't done a thorough walk around. Now, I haven't got details of what time this was done. It may well have been late at night or very early in the morning. There are some contributory factors there. Did they use a torch? Was the aircraft parked in a poorly lit area? But you'd hope that with these red flags hanging off these Pitot covers, if they're using the sort of standard configuration, that these things flapping around would have given you some sort of indication that that something wasn't right. So three areas there were three different teams. That's the engineering team, the ground crew, and the flight crew didn't pick this up. So that was opportunity number one. And I think the take home from this is do a thorough walk around. When we're operating aircraft on quick turnarounds and things, we all walk around the aircraft, and we're looking at the sort of areas that we're particularly used to looking at. And I just think now, just do a double take. I think particularly in these sensitive areas for the Pitots and the statics, just make sure that you just have a second glance at these, particularly now when these aircraft are coming out of storage, or coming out of long periods of being grounded. That your walk around now, when you take one of these aircraft for the first time, when you do return to flying, if it's been sat around for a while or at any time, extra vigilance, I think, will trap these errors in the first place. particularly with cover still being attached. I mean, that's a more obvious case. You could argue that you're probably not going to see the insects stuck inside, so then we come to the second level of mitigation, which we'll take a look at now. The second thing that will be worth looking at is reviewing your rejected takeoff procedure. So what are you going to reject for below 100 knots and between 100 knots and V1? So spend some time just reviewing that as part of your brief and actually your actions in the event of. And just again, brief the importance of a proactive scan during the takeoff roll when it comes to speed. I'd also recommend reviewing the unreliable airspeed procedure and whether or not your aircraft has the backup speed scale. Is it one that you can select so that it's reversible? And just know where it is in the QOH. Fortunately for this crew, they were obviously got onto this pretty quickly and rescued the situation with their knowledge of the unreliable airspeed procedure. So that's ultimately, I think, what saved the day for them. And monitoring speed during the takeoff roll and being extra vigilant. So yeah, I think there's a lot to take from that. There's a lot of opportunities there to we understand what's happened, we understand why it's happened, and there's several areas there that I think would have trapped this error to mitigate it from happening in the first place and from ever happening to us. So I think that's quite an important take home there. Again, no matter what aircraft that you're operating, the crew in this instance carried out the correct procedure and returned overweight, but greater margins of safety could have been achieved had the error been trapped much sooner. And I think that's what we're going to take away from case number 1. Okay, so let's have a look at case number 2. Okay, so let's take a look at case study number 2, again an A330, and this was a speed discrepancy, and it's entitled here at 100 knots. So let's have a look and take a view of what happened. So in the first instance, the at 100 knots, the speed discrepancy was noted and the takeoff was continued at 133 knots. The after departure, the ECAM nav IAS disagree and nav ADR1 fault was noted. The aircraft leveled off at 3,000 feet to troubleshoot, and ECAM actions were completed. And on completion of the ECAM, the selection of air data captain on 3 was selected. So obviously this was ADR1 and ADR3 now on the captain's side for indications. The flight then was resumed to the cruise at flight level 340, and an overspeed warning was noted for a brief period as the aircraft approached its cruise altitude. The crew then elected to do an in-flight return or an in-flight turnaround, and a safe return was then completed. Okay, so another unreliable airspeed or airspeed discrepancy recorded here in the takeoff roll, and this time it was noted at 100 knots, but again the takeoff was continued. So this crew noted it, saw it, acknowledged it, but then continued the takeoff. So let's take a look at why this happened. When the aircraft returned, it was inspected by the maintenance crew there, and it was found that the captain's pitot was obstructed by dust. So on the why subject, let's have a look at the PFD and see why they got the indications, or what indications they got, and why it led to the disagree. So item 1 here, and I'll bring this up as I have done previously. On takeoff, both at the beginning of the takeoff, both PFDs are showing 0, which is normal if on the A330 if the speed is less than 30 knots. Then as the speed increased above 30 knots, the captains indicated 30 and the FOs indicated 47. So that's a 17 knot difference in the indicated speed. On this second phase of the takeoff then, the first officer's speed indicated 80, the standby ISIS also indicated 80, and the captain's was recording as showing 41 knots. So you can see the difference is increasing here because of that blockage. So a 40 knot discrepancy in speed here. Now at 100 knots, and this is where it was noted at the 100 knot call, the first officers and the ISIS standby were both indicating 100 knots, and that's where the call out came. And the captain's, however, was showing 55 knots. So this was kind of the opportunity here to call it a day, I think. At point 4, the captain rotated on the FO's PFD, showing 133 knots. The ISIS was also showing 133 knots, but the captain's was showing 80 knots. So again, quite a significant discrepancy there. Now, to note again, when we have a look in the FCOM here, and this is based on the Airbus 320, again, I don't know about the A330. I have no technical knowledge on that, so I don't know if these phases of flight inhibitions are the same or not. But if you have a look in the A320 FCOM, when you've got a nav IAS discrepancy, it is inhibited between 80 knots and 1500 feet, which is really interesting. So yeah, you're not going to get the indication of IAS disagree at those phases of flight, and you can look at that in the FCOM yourself. So they would have had the opportunity at the initial part when it showed 30 and 47, but at 80 knots, then they're not going to get to the warning until 1500 feet. So yeah, the ECAN not helping you out terribly there. Good. Okay, so that's basically what happened. Yeah. How can we mitigate this, and how can we trap this error? Again, if we start right away from the beginning, a thorough walk around, this may or may not have picked this up. I suspect, again, on the 330, you're not going to be able to peer inside those pitots, and if externally, even with a double check, it looked normal, then you can excuse the crew there. I think we'd all be the same. We'd never see that, so it's very difficult to spot. But again, still be aware that these things can happen. I think that's the sort of takeaway here. But the most important thing here is to be vigilant at cross-checking the speed. And it's exactly the same as it was in case 1 during the takeoff roll. We know the ECAM IS discrepancy is inhibited, so it's not going to give us these warnings between 80 knots and 1500 feet. But we can see that there was a significant airspeed discrepancy at 50, and probably more importantly, arguably more importantly, here at 100 knots. And an opportunity here was missed to reject the takeoff. The overspeed, I don't know. It mentions an overspeed at approaching the cruise altitude of 340. I don't know why they would have got that. I'm just surmising and guessing, which I suppose is always dangerous, that ADR1 may not have been switched off. I don't know. I know they went ADR3 to captain, which would have given them ADR3 indications because the ISIS was showing correct speed compared to PFD2. But anyway, I'm not going to speculate on that. I don't know, and there's no explaining or expansion on that from FCOM in this article. So I'm just mentioning it because they mention it. I'm just guessing, and which, as I say, is always a dangerous thing. So I'm not going to say any more on that. So what are the takeaways from here then? Cross-checking the speed. We know the inhibitions for the ADR disagree, so we have to be super careful when we're cross-checking these speeds. And if you do see a discrepancy there, then call it. And if you've got the opportunity to spot this early, and it's a low-speed RTO, that's a lot less troublesome than spotting it at 130 knots, so just before you're about to rotate, or taking this thing into the air. I think that's the big takeaway there. Okay, so let's have a look at number 3 then. Okay, so the last case study is number 3, and this involves an A320. Yay, I hear you all shout. So obviously relevant to our aircraft type. But again, just a continuation really on the theme. But this is an example of where the 100 knot call works really, really well. And potentially the threats of a rolling takeoff, as the speed in the early part can easily be masked. and just shows just how important that call is in decision making for us. And the opportunity there sort of is this kind of last line of defence, really, for recognising unreliable airspeed and aborting a takeoff on the lower speed side. So, as I say, this is an A320. It was a rejected takeoff at 100 knots. I believe the captain was pilot flying. It talks about EPR, so it was IAE engines, whether that makes any difference. A rolling takeoff was commenced. The engines were then increased to stabilization, EPR. The takeoff thrust was then applied, and then the pilot flying noted the speed discrepancy as the pilot monitoring called 100 knots as they saw it on their PFD. That was the FO in this case, as the captain was flying. The captain then initiated the RTO rejected takeoff procedure. So let's take a look at the PFDs, just as we've done in the previous examples, and I'll bring up the picture as I have done before. I'm not too sure why, but every time I start a new case study, I get an email come through on my phone. So sorry about that. Right, so let's take a look at this clip then from the Airbus Safety Magazine. So point number one here, we've got actually an early speed indication on the captain's side. It's actually showing 45 knots when the aircraft was stationed with the ground speed indicating at 0. So that's, if you like, the first sign, but a bit tricky to spot, I might argue. But given where the 45 knots begins, then we have a look at item number 2. So this is moving on now. This is when takeoff thrust. So after the thrust stabilization, takeoff thrust is applied. Now on the FO side, it indicates 35 knots and a large speed trend arrow showing where the aircraft's going to be accelerating in the next few seconds. But interestingly, on the captain's side, the speed remains at about 49 knots in this case, actually, and a very small indication of acceleration with a very small trend arrow. When we have a look at number 3, then we get the 100 knot cross check. Now on the first officer's side, it showed 100, as did the ISIS standby. So the pilot monitoring, the FO in this case, calls out 100 knots. And on the captain's side, it shows 58 knots. And this is when the captain commences the RTO procedure. Big tick in the box there. And then number 4, the aircraft, after the aircraft is stopped after the RTO, the PFD on the captain's side is still recording a speed of 55 knots. Why did this happen? Well, after the event, the aircraft was pulled in for maintenance, and they found small pieces of leaves in the captain's pitot and in the captain's pitot pressure lines. So that's what caused the blockage. The 100 knot call saved the day, I think, here, but nevertheless there were still opportunities missed here, and it just goes to show the importance of active monitoring of the speed throughout the takeoff roll. So how do we mitigate it, trap the error? Well, the standout lesson here is the importance of the 100 knot call. That's what saved the day here. Ultimately, it gave the pilot flying the opportunity to cross-check, saw that there was a significant difference here, and rejected the takeoff. It may have been detected earlier, as the captain's speed before the takeoff roll was commenced was showing 45 knots. It should have been showing 0 as it was on the FO, so there was an opportunity missed there, and I'm assuming that was the same case during taxi as well. So yeah, I'm guessing that if that was the case, if it had been in there a while, then it would have been there during the taxi as well. But taxiing can be very busy, can't it, really, around complex airports. And then later, as the acceleration commenced, the captain's trend or speed remained pretty stagnant, and the acceleration by the trend arrow was very small. Their speed was steady, whilst the pilot monitoring, the FO in this case, was showing us a more normal indication of acceleration. So there's an opportunity there that would have prevented or could have rejected the takeoff earlier. This all comes back to actively monitoring the speed during the takeoff roll, and I think again that's the takeoff here. It's SOP at the end of the day. So some missed opportunities, but at the same time, a great example of why the 100 knot call is just so important and why it works so well. Now in the magazine here, it talks a little bit more about that and talks about the importance that it's the last line of defence. And I'll just quote it here. Case study 3 shows the importance of the 100 knot cross check, which is requested in the standard operating procedure. It's the last line of defence in preventing a takeoff with unreliable airspeed indication. The flight crew should be prepared to reject a takeoff at the time of the 100 knot cross check if an airspeed discrepancy is observed. And following on from that, there's the article continues and just makes a reference here to COVID. And I may as well just read that out to you now as we're here. Obstructed pitos are the main cause of the reported unreliable airspeed events at takeoff. Contamination of aircraft pitot probes can happen in less than 2 hours on the ground in certain cases. That's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The risk of pitot contamination has increased since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic because there are fewer flights and aircraft spend more time on the ground between flights. Airbus has published several documents to provide recommendations for the prevention of obstructed air data probes on the ground, and I guess that goes out to all the airlines and to their engineering departments. During transits or upon the return to service of a parked aircraft, it's important to pay particular attention to the pitot probes during the maintenance, external aircraft inspection and the pilot's pre-flight exterior walkaround. We saw that in case 1. This will confirm that all protective covers are removed before flight. Early detection of an unreliable airspeed event will enable the flight crew to reject the takeoff at a lower speed. From the start of the takeoff roll, the pilot monitoring must check for inconsistent airspeed indications, abnormal speed trends, and for the absence of airspeed indications, and alert the pilot flying as early as possible if an issue is detected. The 100 knot cross check is the last line of defence to prevent taking off with an unreliable airspeed indication. The flight crew should be prepared to reject the takeoff at that time of a 100 knot cross check if an airspeed discrepancy is observed. And obviously earlier than that, if you observe it as mentioned earlier. It's essential that the flight crew carefully monitor the airspeed indications during every takeoff. Obstruction or contamination of the pitot can occur before any flight. I think that's a nice sort of, I guess, explanation there and summary of really what we're looking at here. So that concludes the first in the hopefully many within the series of Safety Corner. It's gone on quite a long time, this video, because we looked at 3 events, and I've done that because it's all covered in unreliable airspeed, and it was sort of a bolt-on from what we were talking about in the unreliable airspeed briefing. We tend to focus quite a lot on airborne events of unreliable airspeed in the takeoff because we can then perform our memory items, sometimes in the descent as well when we look at sort of pitot blockage, etc. And we tend to forget a little bit about the takeoff roll and the importance of the SOP in monitoring that speed throughout the takeoff roll. So thanks very much for, well, in this case, listening. I hope it's been of use to you and maybe highlights some of the important parts of our standard operating procedures and why these things are very important. And with the help of Airbus in being able to feed these things back to us makes us all safer pilots overall. Thanks for listening. Keep the plate spinning, keep safe, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon.